Follow along as I read, what is community and why is it important? So we're going to read the information below about the lesson, and then we're going to click next to go to part 2, which is where we'll see the actual essay. So about this text, Toby Lowe is a professor of public management who works with government and volunteer organizations to find ways of making public services better. The following text is a summary of Lowe's PhD centered around the use and misuse of the term community. Our purpose for reading is that we're going to understand what a community is so that we can build our understanding about how communities create feelings of both belonging and rejection. And we're going to look out for these words: aspect, moral, narrative, and specific. What is community and why is it important? By Toby Lowe. The word community has a strange power to it. It conveys a sense of togetherness and positivity. It speaks both of solidarity and homeliness. You will almost never hear people say what they mean by community. What does community mean and why is it important? Here are the things that I think a definition of community must be able to explain in order to reflect the various communities in the world. A definition of community must be able to account for the different types of communities that exist in the world. For example, it must be able to account for both the community of place and something more dispersed, like the academic community or the Islamic community. It must be able to account for the positive feelings that people have about community, for example, the sense of togetherness. But without saying that community is necessarily good, after all, one of the best examples of a community is the mafia, and even with the kindest reading of their activities, you'd struggle to argue that, on balance, that they are a force for good in the world. It must be able to explain the sense of identity and belonging associated with community. It must explain the feeling of pride or hurt we feel when the community of which we are a part is praised or attacked. And it must explain the in-group, out-group nature of this identity, why some people are part of a particular community and others are not. The definition of community must be able to explain why community has the normative moral power that it does, how communities shape our sense of what good and bad means. For example, our community shapes our understanding of what being a good neighbor means, the shared understanding of how we should treat people around here. It must be able to explain why community is different from other social groups, such as society, family, or just a group of people. It must be able to account for the fact that people can be part of a different community simultaneously. Given that framing, I offer this as my definition of community. A community is a group of people who share an identity forming narrative. This means a group of people who share a story that is so important to them that it defines an aspect of who they are. Those people build the shared story archetypes of that community into their sense of themselves. They build the history of those communities into their own personal history, and they see the world through the lens of those shared stories. So, one of the communities that I consider myself to be part of is the community based around the city of Newcastle. The manifestations of this are that I take pride in showing people around the city. I feel slighted when people say horrible things about it. I feel at home whenever I hear a Gordy accent, despite not having one myself, and so on. But that makes me part of this community. It's my choice to write Newcastle stories into my own story. The character traits for how Gordys are supposed to behave: be friendly, talk to strangers at bus stops, support Newcastle United, etc., are character traits that I have adopted. I take part in shared events where this story is played out, such as attending football matches at St. James Park and other cultural events in the city. I feel that arguments about the future of the city should this building be built here? What green spaces does the city need, etc., are arguments about my own future. I see arguments about the UK's future through the lens of the future of Newcastle. It is this choice to participate in the making and remaking of these stories about the city that makes me part of the community of Newcastle. It's not just about where you live or where you work. It is possible to live and work in Newcastle without doing these things, without becoming part of this community. And there are many people who are from Newcastle originally, but who now live elsewhere, who would still consider themselves part of the Newcastle community because they still take an active part in the conversations about what it means to be part of this community. Let's see how this definition works against the 6 key criteria for being an accurate and useful definition of community. It can account for all the different kinds of community, what people call communities of interest and communities of place. The essence of community is a shared story. That story can be about a place, or it can be about a religion or any other social practice. It can account for the positive feelings people have about being part of a community, the sense of shared identity, of being part of something larger than we are, is well known as a source of good feeling. Communities can be positive social forces, doing good in the world, and they can be negative, doing harm, and they can be both of those things at once. Community is not in and of itself morally praiseworthy. It just is. The definition of community explains the nature of shared identity in communities and highlights the specific mechanism by which this occurs. It is the process of telling a story about yourself that draws on the shared cultural story archetypes, which create and maintain a shared identity. It explains why community has the normative force that it does, because it is our narratives that provide us with our explanations for what good and bad look like. A good neighbor is someone who fits the story we tell ourselves about how a good neighbor behaves. A good colleague is someone who fits the archetype of that character, of how that character behaves, etc. Our narratives provide our moral framing. It explains why community is different from other social groups. A community is a group with a shared identity forming narrative. This is different from the set of people who live in a place who have a shared interest. The definition understands that people can be part of many communities simultaneously, and also how they can become part of and drift away from particular communities. It also is able to account for the tension that people can feel when they are a part of multiple communities, when different aspects of their identity defining stories clash. For example, community is a group of people who share a story that is so important to them that it defines an aspect of who they are. Those people build the shared story archetypes of the community into their sense of themselves. They build the history of those communities into their own personal history, and they see the world through the lens of those shared stories. Why does this matter? On one level, this is simply a plea for a more precise use of language. I'm not saying that community is the only or even most important social grouping, but it is a particular type of social grouping that explains the strong sense of shared identity that people feel, and membership of particular groups give us a lens through which we see the world. Why community is a helpful concept for understanding and creating social change. I think my key message is that community is an important concept for social change because it helps us to see that social change requires a change in some of the most important stories we tell ourselves. Social change requires that we rewrite our communal narratives. Social change is change in community.